he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, Māori ora. Cease those winds from the west, those from the south, the intermingling of those of the land and of the sea, a touch of frost, a touch of sleet, a red-tipped dawn, the promise of a glorious day. Kei runga ki a tātou katoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, kei ngā tiomana tēnā tātou.
Okay, so for those who may be confused, we have a workshop this morning, 10 o'clock. And so I'll pass that on to Gavin to facilitate or Tom.
Sorry, Chair, just a question and process. What's the workshop about?
Well,
So you've no agenda of the workshop?
There has been a change, so I'll leave it to Tom to explain.
So,
I'd like to know who's giving the orders so I can know whether I'm going to like them or not.
Well, Gavin and I did send an email out to all.
but there was no agenda as to what was to be discussed in the workshop attached to that?
Well, I'm only in governance, I'm not in...
He's only the boss today.
So I'll pass it over to management and maybe they can explain to us.
It's worrying when the bloody leader doesn't have a security clearance for the stuff.
So thank you. The purpose of the workshop and the reason for having the workshop, obviously ahead of the decision, is hopefully a matter of simple logic. We're focusing initially in this workshop on the drinking water aspects of the plan change. And then the workshop will also cover nutrient management rules and change of land use rules. And I believe there's a discussion around priority water allocation rules, which comes up later in the paper.
What the agenda was? It just says there's a whole bunch of documents.
Yeah, and so we'll work through. So those documents form the basis of information that we're going to be talking to right now.
Again, Tom, my point being is that we got a whole bunch of documents in an email. Had no idea what we're supposed to be looking through and going through and reading them. When we're going through and reading what we're going to be discussing. I just think it's a poor process that we're not advised what the agenda of a workshop, what we're actually going to be talking about in the workshop. We're just told there is a workshop.
Yep. So the content of the workshop is then translated into the papers that have been presented as part of the council decision this afternoon.
That would have been nice to have known.
I will take that on board. Thanks, Councillor. I just want to.
In the absence of the CEO, it's up to the chairman of the regional council to communicate to...
That was a nice high ball, Cora.
about communication issues and the inference that the tail may be wagging the dog.
Sorry, excuse me, Gordon.
Could I request whatever the agenda is, can you put it up on the whiteboard so I know what's going to hit me before it hits me?
Yep, we can write.
It's on the whiteboard? Bex?
Yep. So the first item, I'll get Kerry to write up joint working drinking water.
All of the agenda.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to note that we are currently waiting on. We've reversed the order slightly, and the reason we've reversed the order slightly is that Marianne Baker is literally getting off a plane, returning from Argentina as we speak, and hopefully having a shower and coming straight in to talk to the nutrient rules. So we're confident that she's going to be here, but we were going to lead with the nutrient discussion, so we've just reversed that around. So I'm going to hand over to Rena Douglas now, and Rena, you can introduce your guests, who are probably well known to everyone anyway.
Thank you. Morena koutou. We are kicking off this morning with a discussion on the drinking water rules and policies. You will have noticed that we have some new, some guests that may be known to some of you. They are here to represent the joint working group from the Havelock North Drinking Water Inquiry. So we have Craig Fu, Garth Cowie, who is the chair of the joint working group and is also the chair of the joint governance group, and Dr. Nick Jones from the DHB, and sorry, Craig is from Hastings District Council. So why they are here is to provide added context to this presentation around some of the rationale of the JWG's recommendations and to possibly assist me with some of the more technical aspects of this presentation. So we will kick off. You'll see that the slide I've put up sets out what I'm hoping to cover today. We're going to briefly go over the background to these rules and policies. We're going to look at some of the issues that have been considered, potential contamination sources, how are source protection zones determined, recommendations that were made to TANC, and finally what we're asking of RPC today. So just by way of background, the TANC group appointed the joint working group as a working group of TANC. So slightly different in that all the other working groups of TANC were formed within the TANC group itself. The joint working group has been set up as part of the Havelock North Drinking Water Inquiry to address matters relating to that inquiry. So the reason why TANC looked at this group as a suitable vehicle was that there was already a considerable amount of expertise and knowledge that were already in one place, so it was felt that it was sensible to have the joint working group driving the recommendations. To assist it, we had a consultancy called Good Earth Matters. They were contracted to help the JWG, and they've got extensive experience in drinking water policy issues and also have worked very closely with councils in this region, so are very familiar with the Hawke's Bay context. So yeah, over a period of time, there was a lot of work done between all groups, and final recommendations were made to TANC at its 26th July meeting. So these are the key issues that JWG considered in bringing these recommendations to you today. The first one was identifying some of the risk activities in the catchments. The second issue was looking at whether or not we can strengthen the current permitted activity rules in the regional plan. And thirdly was whether or not these source protection zones could be used within the TANC plan change. So we're going to step through all of these. So this diagram I've put up just tries to set out some of the potential contaminant sources that were stock taked, and for example, bulk storage of chemicals, heavy industry, you've got on-site wastewater disposal, dairy feedlots. Yeah, so there's a whole range of potential sources that were looked at in considering these recommendations.
Excuse me? Did you look at the dump? The old dump?
Yes, yeah. So that would have been considered as part of all the different contaminant sources. Yeah.
We're increasing nitrogen, dissolved nitrogen, or nitrogen considered as a contaminant source, like as the issues they've had down in, was it South Canterbury with the blue baby syndromes and stuff?
Under the land use rule.
Yes, under the land use rule it was considered. Yeah.
Seem to be missing horticulture up here.
So this was just, sorry, I should have been a bit more clear. This was just an example of some of the types that were identified. Really, the list is quite big, so I just meant to show some of the types of things that were addressed.
Is the full list available in the documents being provided later?
Yeah. So if we look at source protection zones, Hastings District Council has really been kind of leading the way regionally in this space. They engaged Tonkin & Taylor, who are well known to many of you for their consultancy work, and they set about establishing what they consider to be some zones for protecting the source of drinking water. I might get Craig to speak to that, if that's okay.
Good morning, all. So what we had Tonkin and Taylor do and was look at, first and foremost, is we did sanitary assessments, so looking at all those hazard sources in and around the bores. And then we would, GNS had done some work around the country, and there's a really good report around Greater Wellington where they had actually done some work in source protection zone work. Tonkin and Taylor looked at a number of ways of analysing and working out how big is a zone. A lot of the discussion in the maps you have talks about SPZ2, and that's a one-year collection zone. And the reason we use 1 year is from a public health issue, most of the contaminants, the majority of contaminants and those of particular interest die off in the ground within 1 year. So the bacteriological issues like Campylobacter and so forth, they die within 1 year. Protozoa risks like Giardia and Cryptosporidium die off within 1 year. Historic knowledge was that viruses die off 1 year. Now picking up on international literature, that's potentially could double that, but the base work, most of the issues are 1 year. There are some chemicals that persist, and that's why we have what's called a source protection zone 3, or an area we understand 3, and that's to deal with some particular chemicals that once they're in the water, they stay in the water and they have no degradation. Tonkin and Taylor worked first of all with, we looked to see if we could take the greatly enhanced regional model that the Regional Council had been developing for the tank process. Due to the way that model works at a regional level, it wasn't able to provide the level of detail required to use that to define the exact 1 year collection zone. So what they did then is they picked up out of the US EPA what's called, if I just make sure I get the name of it right, the US EPA's Wellhead Analytical Element Model. So it's an analytical model, and it looks at flow paths, how much water you're sucking through, the depths. They've also added into that consideration of confining layers and the rate of extraction. And in that, they've used that analysis. They then ran a number of sensitivities to say, well, what if the flow direction changed direction? There's seasonality to our aquifer where the head levels change, so what effect does that have? And all of that work has been peer reviewed by Kath Moore at GNS. It's quite difficult getting all those reports back from GNS given their workload, and she's a very busy lady. And so that peer review and her comments have been adapted through and signed off on the approach. Adding to the zone as a water authority, we do a whole pile of other risk analysis inside. So that map there you see, if I just get up, so in Hastings City where we've done it, the main ball field at Eastbourne Street, this green line is a 1 year collection zone. So at its extremity, the water takes 1 year to get from here to here at its maximum pumping rate. So this is conservative, it works on worst case scenario. The Eastbourne field is affected by the take at Hines Wattie, so it also, we've analysed that with Hines Wattie's done. And you get different shapes. So Wilson Road, that's a 1 year collection because the way the aquifer works is quite different there than it does in Eastbourne. And Portsmouth has a different shape again because the direction of flow is more variable. So these zones are the collection of the sensitivity analysis. So there is a level of conservatism in it, but that's so we can be assured we understand what the activities, and particularly the at-risk activities, are within those zones. The coloured area picks up where the non-confined area of the aquifer is, which obviously changes those risks a little more.
Were SPZ maps prepared for the Napier catchment for Napier bores? If not, why not?
We understand that they haven't prepared maps, but they are speaking with Tonkin and Taylor about kicking off a similar process.
Okay, so we're looking at approving a plan today, or putting a plan through, recommending a plan, part of a plan through today, without maps for the Napier bores?
So we'll get into this in greater detail in the latter part of the presentation, but in the absence of source protection zones, as you've seen on those maps, there will be a default 2-kilometre radius around bores and drinking water supply takes that are called provisional protection zones.
Yep.
And they are there to recognise that there hasn't been the work that's been done to the same extent as Hastings has, but they provide that level of protection until such time Napier has that more bespoke information that would allow them to say, right, this is our source protection zone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another question then. That's for SPZ2, which is the microbiological, yeah, whatever it is. You're right. What about the other, the nitrates and heavy metals and the like that could also be considered health risk issues? Why? So an SPZ3 map.
We do have, in the development of the SPZ2, we do have an SPZ3 map.
Yep.
The key focus in the areas of sort of in terms of planning controls following through, we were focused on those things that have the higher likelihood of creating direct sickness. In terms of the nitrates, that's actually wider because obviously there's the municipal supplies and other registered supplies, which might be 25 people or 500 people. There's a wider monitoring around the environmental monitoring to make sure we stay in the good place this region is without high nitrates, because no one here and the Joint Working Group has talked about wanting to make sure we never end up where Canterbury is, because it's very difficult to turn it around because it's decades to turn it around.
I appreciate
So
that.
there are SPZ3 maps developed as part of this process. The focus was though on that 1 year microbiological protozoa and some of the virus elements, because it's about highlighting areas we want to understand what activities are happening, have some input as a water supplier and knowledge of what activities are going on, and be able to limit some of those elements.
Okay, I accept that you've taken microbiological stuff as a priority. That's fine, but we're talking about putting together a plan which is to be reviewed in 10 years' time. So why has there nothing I can see in the proposed wording of the plan to talk about SPZ3 maps or talk about that sort of issue?
Can I just comment? Answer your questions, Paul. Remember, this is, if you go back to first principles, the reason for source protection zones is it's about the multi-barrier approach. Yep. So we're looking at trying to strengthen the first barrier, the protection of the drinking water source. There was before already some protection. We had this thing called an unconfined aquifer zone, where there were different rules around activities than in the confined aquifer zone. And we debated about do the general rules already provide sufficient protection? And our view was that we needed extra protection for drinking water sources, particularly those for larger urban water supplies. And so we are doing the best we can to try and get in place a regime that provides that extra protection as soon as possible. The work that HDC have initiated itself has been groundbreaking work, and obviously is setting a number of precedents for what probably will be rolled out across the country in terms of some of the work that they're doing. But the reality is that that work hasn't yet been done for Napier. Napier have scheduled it. I understand it's in their work plan for this year. So one of the issues then is how do we get sufficient flexibility in the new plan so that we can rapidly bring that zone into the regime as soon as it's been demonstrated to be valid. Yep. And so we're interested in the committee's idea on how to do that. But I think we've already started thinking about ways in which that zone can quickly become part of the plan once it's operative. The other thing, which is you talked about the chemical contaminants. I think they're valid concerns. We are basing it on a risk. So the work that Tonkin and Taylor have done is they have tried to look at matching the risk to the zone, so the zone of greatest risk. And when you get into the rules themselves, you'll see that the rules are also based on risk. So the risk of the activity, what's the most appropriate control method for it. In some cases, we're talking about requiring consents. In some cases, in very few cases, it's prohibition. In most cases, it's about, in the land use one, it's about understanding your risks and having a plan in place. So you'll see when you get into the rules, it's about matching that risk to that geographical extent. What else was I going to say? Oh, that's probably enough for the moment.
I'd probably just add in terms of, I think, the line of inquiry, Councillor, is that the overall nutrient management regime throughout the entire catchment is pervasive throughout the plan change in terms of, I think what you're talking about is making sure that the track for those nutrients is heading in the right direction.
Yeah, what I don't want to see is a headline in the Hawke's Bay today. Don't feed your baby formula because you might get blue baby syndrome. And
Canterbury were very lucky because they put commissioners in.
yeah,
That's why it happened.
so
And I don't want to see that either.
Yeah.
Councillor, we certainly don't want to see it. And the DHB would have a lot of trouble signing up to a plan change where that's likely to happen. So
you're confident that the plan change is enough to deal with that issue?
I think it's going to be. I think we're going to have to be adaptive, and we're going to have to keep our eye on the ball. But we certainly have got you look at the plan change overall, the nutrient management side of it. That's what you're really talking about, I think, in terms of potential contamination of groundwater with nitrates. And one of the things I've thought about is if our approach that we are proposing, which is very much industry good standard based collaborative approach, if that doesn't work, then we need to have a plan B, which is a more restrictive approach.
Second, if you're comfortable with it, Nick, I'm happy with it.
So I thought when I was preparing this presentation, I thought it would be good to add a bit of context and show at the moment the registered drinking water supplies in the region. So Councillor Bailey, you were talking about the lack of SPZs for Napier, and I referred to the provisional protection zone. So the blue splodges, for want of a better word, or circles, they are the 2 kilometre radius around the current registered drinking water supplies in the region. And there is a few colours which show in a bit more detail what those sources are. So for example, you have Rai, which is the olivey colour, local authority blue, health, which is orange. So it just tries to add a bit more detail in terms of what we're talking about. And then of course we have the SPZs for Hastings, which are those oblongy shapes with the blue lines in it as well. So I just thought it would be good to put that up to give you some visual point of reference as to what we were discussing.
I think it's fair to point out to councillors though that those the rules associated with the default zones are considerably less onerous than the other rules.
Yeah.
So you're going to have, you have a municipal well, and you're going to have an exclusion zone around the municipal well, which I think is a wonderful idea. What are you excluding?
We'll get into that.
When you get into that?
Yeah. So we're moving into that. It's a good question. So
all those indicators on that map are for current suppliers of drinking water to urban settings.
They're registered supplies, so that some of them may be as small as a marae. They may be a community of 25 people. They're not individual households, unless for some reason that household is registered, and it might potentially be registered on the drinking water register if they are perhaps operating a business out of there or a function centre or something like that.
So if supply is based on a bore, and most of them would be, I would say, is there a physical structure around those bores to stop contamination by cows or whatever?
Council.
We're going to get into that.
Well, they just sitting out there in a paddock, because if there was some kind of physical structure around them, maybe a concrete pad and a building, and that would give us a greater comfort here.
So there is, yeah, there is quite rigorous standards as to how bores are to be maintained and constructed, and my understanding is that our compliance team has been undergoing a sort of series of checks or monitoring of those bores around.
I know these bores around that don't have that.
Are they registered drinking
Well,
waters?
they would have to be, because they would have had to have a consent.
No, not registered though. My bore's not registered.
Yeah.
No.
Registered for this framework under
A
this
consent, but
framework,
not
so-
registered.
So, through you, Chair, just in response to that, I think there's two sets of bores, and we may be having both conversations at once there.
Okay,
So,
yep.
bores in general, and particularly bores inside a protection zone, are a potential risk, and that's definitely where the compliance team are working through a prioritised program of checking other bores, are they sealed around it, are they above ground, and a number of other elements. Taking the learnings from a few years ago. The other part, which is in education and working through now with these smaller supplies, is, and there's an element of health in there, there's an element around Building Act requirements in terms of communication to actually help explain and educate and assist groups working through that. Actually, if you are taking this water and you're supplying for those people, it should be sealed around it. What are the controls? You should have a fence to keep stock 5 metres away or longer. Don't put a septic tank anywhere near it. So there's a big education program that goes with this, and that's a number of the discussions we've been having at the
Thank
joint
you. I only asked the question because I'm ignorant of it.
Yep. It's a real issue.
Registered drinking water, because there's obviously two groups, there's individuals and there's others. How do you, for example, do you request to be registered or not? And obviously I'm thinking of the ice.
Yes.
How do you get on that register?
It's an interesting question, and I've been pushing the Ministry of Health on this because there are some requirements in the Health Act for certain supplies that have to be registered, but I can anticipate that clearly some groups would see advantages in being registered for this very reason, that they might get additional protection of their drinking water. And the response I've had from the Ministry is that, well, that's not really the purpose of the register. But I haven't had a no as well. So I suggest that the way groups would do that, whether they would approach the drinking water assessors at the DHB and say, we'd like to be registered. And then there would be a process, the registration process. There are some downsides in being registered. There's potentially, an annual compliance check, and so it would be something that communities would probably want to weigh up, whether there's enough upside to look into doing that. But I can see why that might be of interest.
So this current group are voluntary registered.
The ones on there will be all required to be registered, by and large, I suspect. The ministries under the previous government, or probably under the previous regime, the intention was to try and minimise compliance costs for smaller communities. So they were looking to try and make it easier for people not to be registered. And I think probably the pendulum's kind of swung back the other way, because as regional councils and environmental plans are looking to use registered supplies as being denoting areas are of higher risk, then there's more advantage in being registered.
So are these groups compliant? Is it voluntary or not voluntary for this particular
The ones that you
exercise?
see there, I would suggest would be all required to be registered under the law. There may be one or two that are not, but I think mostly they would be required to be registered.
So there are others that would add.
So now we've been through some of the technical stuff. We're going to talk through some of the recommendations that were made to the TENK group. So 3 options were put forward, and this was on the back of quite a bit of lengthy analysis, discussion and consultation between JWG, Good Earth Matters and of course the TENK group. So I'll talk you through the 3 options that were put forward to the TENK. Option A was to include a new objective and supporting policy in the plan change for registered drinking water source protection, minus any spatial definition or additional regulation. That wasn't recommended. Option B was include a new objective in supporting policy for registered drinking water source protection. This includes a spatial definition of SPZs where known, which we've discussed, and a default 2 kilometre radius applied elsewhere, which is referred to as provisional protection zones. The final option, which was recommended to the TANT group, was to have a new option and policy for registered drinking water supplies source protection, spatial definition of 2 kilometre radius applied elsewhere, PPZs or provisional protection zones, and regulation of specified activities located within mapped SPZs. So just to unpack the detail of that a bit more, option C, why that was recommended was that it was felt that it provided improved source protection for registered drinking water supplies within the TANT catchment and would include policies for source protection that provided decision makers with the ability to have greater visibility as to the activities occurring in those source protection zones that could potentially pose risks. So some of the further detail was that for activities that already required resource consent, there would be matters of control and discretion that would enable risks to be considered where those activities are located in SPZs. Introducing consenting for activities located in SPZs, which Dr. Jones touched on earlier. Amending some of the permitted activity rules so that they met NES requirements. And also, Councillor Bailey, I should have probably picked this up a bit earlier, but farm environment plans, there is going to be, NES, National Environmental Standard, consultation with water supply authorities to identify measures to manage risks to drinking water sources. So farm environment plans have already been discussed in other presentations and workshops we've had, but an idea was had that we can link the requirements set out in those farm environment plans to the provision of safe drinking water.
Those
In a SPZ, sorry.
those options you've got located in SPZs and so on a couple of times on either bullet point 1 and 2. Does that include PPZs as well in that definition or that discussion?
Different rules.
Different roles, yeah.
I thought the only reason there's a PPZ is because a SPZ hasn't been finalised because the work hasn't been done on it.
The background to this probably is the National Environmental Standard for Protection of Drinking Water Sources, which is an existing standard under the RMA, and it does draw a distinction between communities of more than 500 people and the sources supplying more than 500 people and sources supplying less than 500 people. So there are some rules in that standard for the larger communities around what permitted activity rules can be in a plan. So that's part of the background, I think, is that at least at the high level, there's a distinction between large communities and small communities. I think we've gone further with what we proposed here, and that we're saying actually any defined SPZ, the new rules would apply.
So if the SPZ for the Napier water supply isn't defined until 2 years down the track, then it would, once it's defined, it would be automatically applied. And in the meantime, none of these rules apply to the Napier City.
I defer to the policy experts on that.
Yes, but the way the TANT plan change has been drafted is that it's going to be adaptive. So once they have the SPZ specified, then they will be included in the.
Okay, so in the meantime, the people of Napier are not offered these protections because they're only in a PPZ.
They're not, the full set of suites wouldn't apply, no. But you've got to remember that there potentially could be significant changes to land use, and potentially landowners could be affected if they happen to be in these SPZs. So there's a process that we have to work through here. I'm all for more protection, but I'm also recognising that we have to understand what the implications are going to be in terms of the existing land users. And
there's also a risk to the people of Napier, because they're not offered the full suite of protections that the people of Hastings are.
So we're talking about multiple barriers, and this is the first barrier. And then the next barrier is going to be around the treatment, and the third barrier is around the monitoring, and the fourth barrier is around the response to any incident.
So through you, Chair, just not speaking for Napier City and Mr Kingsford, my counterpart there, they are not looking at a 2-year period, they're looking at doing it as fast as possible. Their objective would be to get it in, at worst, as a submission to the plan, would be my view, at worst. And for us, we have smaller supplies, such as Whakatū, and we are working strongly with Tonkin and Taylor, because they're a little bit simpler than the big ones, and we've worked through the methodology and worked out what doesn't work and what does, so we hope to do it faster. So those smaller supplies we're looking to have done, those zones fully mapped by the end of January, if not middle of February, by the time they're peer reviewed.
And so, Councillor, sorry, we've also got to be conscious of the timeframes it takes to get this plan operative. So I think that gives us ample room to hopefully have these rules in.
Hopefully.
My question is the impact on the rules to new developments. So, in particular, Marae and Papakāinga. So, it doesn't look like there's been consideration given to Papakāinga or Marae, given we're actually entering our restoration, revitalisation phase. So, one, when they're not connected, normally Marae are not connected to the main lines. So, they've got to put in bores, or they truck in water, which is what the Maraes do at the moment. They truck in water, or at least back in Central Hawke's Bay they do. But there is some clear plans ahead for Papakāinga development and restoration around those areas of the Marae. And so, one, we used to get water from the rivers, and then we were the last person on the block, and we were obstructed from getting that. So now we have to put in bores, and then on top of it is the regulations. So I was wanting to know what considerations you have made in these changes, plan change, in regards to Papakāinga development in Marae for the whole of the Hawke's Bay region.
So at the moment, we're just talking about these circles, aren't we? There's no marae in these circles except one urban marae. Are we widening the discussion to?
Well, the regulations and laws will affect.
Only the tank catchments. Yeah.
Well, there's plenty of...
And they'll set precedents, won't they? So I'm asking in that context. They set precedents.
If the new Papakāinga development met the criteria for being a registered water supply, then yes, it would be a registered water supply, and the rules around registered supplies would apply. If the new development were a series of individual households with their own supplies, then the rules of the Building Act would apply. And I think there is a wider question, which is to what extent can this plan or can the regional council put in place rules that protect every individual household? And this is something we have talked about in the JWG. At the moment, the national policy setting is actually at the individual household level. It's between the individual household owner and the council, who is the regulator for individual household water supplies. But the regional council has a responsibility to maintain the quality of the water in the ground. And we have those policies in place at the policy level, but whether we can have specific rules around restriction of land use activities around every home, I think is another question.
So what?
Does anyone want to comment? Tom?
So there's been none.
So probably just through you, Chair, just in the joint working group there has been discussion on that vein because we have Nio from Ngāti Kahungunu, who's one of the representatives both on TANC, and he was in the session. So we've actually talked through, we haven't come up with any locked in I guess a set criteria in particular for Papakāinga or Marae, but what this framework allows is if someone does join even if they don't legally have to, they get afforded these additional controls and abilities. And one of the discussions we did, there was quite a lot of discussion within the group and at Tank was, can those provisional zones, do they deserve, or can we, is there enough robustness to them to afford the additional planning controls to where that supplies had the additional work to confirm that 2K is the right one, or it's a 1K, or in fact might be a 5K. The principles also apply not just for groundwater, and there's a number of supplies around the wider district which are a blend of shallow groundwater next to rivers, so actually the river is part of the source protection zone. I guess just to your last part of your question around what about outside of the tank zone, so the Joint Working Group and the Joint Committee of Council, DHB and Ngāti Kaununu, some of the plan change ideas actually we couldn't do because it would need a regional plan change where you would do this so it affords the protections in Wairoa and CHB and the like. So this is very much a step on a journey to afford these types of protections and additional if it doesn't work for our whole region.
But can I also add that from the District Health Board's perspective, and I think from the JWG's perspective, the health of Papakāinga communities and of small rural communities is very much on our mind, and it's a priority for us. And there are related issues around the proximity of the wastewater from septic tanks, for example, to groundwater intakes that are obviously very important. We do have a drinking water facilitator whose job is to work with communities and provide them information. So we love to talk further about your concerns. But I guess the question is, how much can this plan change itself solve all of those problems?
I'm just mindful of the precedents it sets.
Yes.
And just an answer about the marae. There are a lot of marae that are no longer standing, that due to settlement whānau are looking to revitalise and restore. So we're not just talking about existing bricks and mortar.
Yeah, I just thought we were talking about this page, but am I wrong?
So that's what I mentioned before.
I had a question on this page that get back to the subject. So all these circles and all these coloured things, what we're basically saying is that to have an activity in here, you've got to have a consent going forward.
Not for the circles, not for the little ones.
Not for the circles, just for the yellow.
Just for the SPZs.
Just for the yellow.
Yep.
And only for certain activities.
Ah, that's right.
So what's
The devil's in the detail.
Yeah, that's right, Nick.
What's the technical rationale for the demarcation zones?
Of the SPZs or the circles?
Yeah, both.
Okay, well, we'll start with the SPZs.
So as I briefly mentioned before, so the SPZs have been developed by quite some detailed analysis looking at the hydraulic characteristics of the aquifer in those zones and the flow directions, how much water is being drawn in by those particular bores and bores in their proximity. So it's worked out by quite a sophisticated calculation, and the SPZ2 line is a 12-month travel distance pumping at the full consented allowance, even though that may not be the situation. If you pumped at the full consented allowance with the hydraulic and the characteristics of the aquifer for those bores, that's 12 months from the outside of that line under various situations of seasonality, so it picks up some sensitivity in it. The second line was based off GNS guidance as if you have nothing else, draw a 2-kilometre circle. The Joint Working Group and the scientists are looking at, is there a slightly better shape? Because if there's a strong, if you are in an aquifer take, if there's a strong direction, it's probably more of an egg shape or a teardrop shape. But for nothing else, a 2-kilometre circle is a good start point. And that also helps the regional council planners looking at consents under the NES requirements.
So you wouldn't be able to distinguish between what people are drawing in terms of drinking water and industrial use. So how do you know there's too much water being utilised?
One of the things we've thought about doing is trying to combine the files of the district councils, building files of the district councils with the bore logs so that we can work out which ones are likely to be used for domestic water supply.
Good guesswork.
And if I could just add that in terms of the focus of this presentation, we are focusing specifically on
Drinking water.
on
I understand
drinking
that,
water.
but-
And the allocation issues that you talk about, yeah, we've been over and will continue to go over in terms of the overall prioritisation.
How did you come up with the 2K?
It was
You
already-
said, if nothing else, the 2K provisional is okay, so how did you qualify 2K?
Yeah, so that's an existing guideline in the existing plan that we have. I understand that that was based on GNS, the GNS report that was briefly discussed. Yeah.
Can I just going back to Rex's question about the SPZ2 map? I took from that that the likes of the Frimley Park and the Eastbourne Street ones aren't actually accepted as being SPZ2 because they're not coloured in, or is that? Am I incorrect in that assumption? Because when I looked at that map, I assumed all that area that's in all those circles are SPZs.
Correct. I think we got confused on the maps and the colours a little bit. So
So,
That pointed out was the
this is that is an SPZ2. It's just this zone is SPZ2 and in the unconfined area. The rule
Oh, okay,
restrictions
right.
exist in here as well.
yeah.
And so as a district council, we'll be going through our district plan, changing our district plan, well, because our old district plan had rules controlling use in the unconfined because we were under a former hypothesis that proved to be incorrect.
Yep.
Controlling activities in that zone is equally important as in that zone. There are some high risks in here because it can get through
Yeah.
faster. But someone drilling a bore here, same risk as someone drilling a bore here.
Yeah. No, it's just
And it.
it's just unfortunate that the legend didn't actually explain that what the yellow was for.
Yes.
I would encourage you to look at the actual rules themselves, and I think they're in attachment 1.
I just wanted to clarify just a practical thing. Is that because that's where the aquifer's sweeping through there? Is that what's happening, Craig?
There is lots of things happening all at once, and so you have
Groundwater flow, but it's risk as well.
it's groundwater flow. It's so there's quite direct channels through here, and
Yeah.
then here in the main flow, and it's flowing through. But it's
Okay,
also-
so it is
it's
going.
how much has been
yeah,
taken.
Yeah.
So this
One there, that's
the peak maximum take here is like 3 times higher or 4 times
Yeah.
higher than the peak maximum take here.
Yeah.
So this one's in a defined channel. It's just a whole mixture of many variables. The Frimley you'll see is very similar shape to Eastbourne.
Okay.
So what we are talking about is in our agenda pack, part of item 7, which some people may want to have another look at.
Okay. So just going back to the recommendations, the Tank Group were presented these options on the 24th of July, as I've previously referenced, and they supported the recommendation subject to some technical refinement around the maps, which we are working through at the moment. Just for your information as well, we also brought the package, or elements of it, I should say, to the Joint Governance Committee for Drinking Water at its 15th of August meeting, and there was a fairly robust discussion there, very similar issues raised, and on the whole they supported the approach, again with the proviso that we work through those minor technical refinements. So what we're seeking from RPC today is really your support to option C. So to reiterate, we introduced a new option and policy for registered drinking water supplies source protection being included in the tank plan change. And there would be that spatial definition of a 2-kilometre radius applied elsewhere, the provisional protection zones, and regulation of specified activities located within mapped SPZ areas. So that's the end of the presentation, but we're happy to take questions on that.
Mr. Chair.
So I was under the impression that we were only considering at this table areas where there was disagreement. You're saying that after all of this, there's nothing being contested in this recommendation that we need to be mindful of?
So given the significance of the issue, it was felt that this was something that should be put in front of the RPC today.
And in addition, it was obviously agreed at the tank table that there was no point the tank group doing a separate piece of work to the joint working group, which was obviously incredibly focused in this area. So there was an agreement around the tank table that they would effectively let the joint working group do the work, receive the recommendation, and take a recommendation of the joint working group. So that's a bit of a process step that separates this issue from all the other issues in the tank group. So
if I could follow, if I don't know whether we're going to have any other opportunity on these other issues to hear from the DHB representative. What I would like to know is from DHB's standpoint, looking at the entire plan and as a submitter in this process eventually, are you basically prepared today to bless this plan?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Question for you.
As
We're not going to hear from you again, I suspect.
Okay, so as I said before, and I've said it at Tank, I believe that we need to have a provision or a regime within the plan that if after monitoring and after trialling the current, the bulk of the procedures and the rules that are in place and the framework that we're putting in place, it's not succeeding, then I think we need to have a backup plan. So some way that we can say, particularly around those issues around nutrients, we're doing our best and we've had our farm management plans and we've had all these things, but they're not working. Therefore, we need to have something else that will give assurance to all parties that we don't have to wait for another 20 years or something to deal with the issues.
But presently, as this sets its various water quality standards, its various, drinking water protections and so forth, as the protector of public health in the region, this plan is satisfactory as a starting point to you?
Look, I've been part of that tank group for 5 years and no one gets everything that they want. It's about, us coming together as a group to try and get the maximum gain for everyone. So I honour that process that I've been part of. That's my point. That if you asked me if there was something that I wanted to add, that I think is the key point, which is it's around the review process and around there being an ability for us to ratchet up the controls if we're not reaching what I think are good values and are good targets in the plan.
Mr. Chair. I just want to be clearer before giving any imprimatur in principle to go to the rules themselves. That's where the rubber hits the road. And I want to go to page 37 of the attachment 1, the RO, Regional Resource Management Plan rule. Goes rule 1, 2, etc. I'm seeing there under rule 1, for example, the drilling, construction, alteration of bores, that's its status as a controlled activity, and yet one of the conditions is that the bore is not located within the source protection zone. So is that telling me that that's a prohibited activity or a controlled activity in the zone? You got that on attachment 1, page 37?
Goes to restricted discretion.
Oh, yeah, here it is. So,
Rule 1, bore drilling, it says it's controlled,
Yep.
but the next column says it can't be located there. So
Right.
can you tell me if it's a prohibited activity or a controlled activity in the zone?
Restricted discretion.
I think it's a,
Should be restricted discretion.
so that's in the matters for the conditions and standards and terms column of the consenting
Yeah.
to take into account.
It's restricted discretionary.
Yeah, restricted discretionary.
Well, next to it's got controlled, and then under Rule 2, it's got restricted discretionary. So can you help me there understand that?
We might have to go back and have a look and make sure that we've referenced that properly.
So you're thinking it's a restricted discretionary, is that correct?
That's what I'm thinking, yeah. I'll have to double check that though.
Just continuing on then to things such as feedlots and feed pads. So you're saying there that it's a permitted activity, and yet the next column says it's the feed pad or feedlot is not located there. So is it permitted or not permitted?
It's permitted if it's not in the SPZ.
Yeah, it's correct. Yeah.
Which is correct.
That's permitted if it's not in the SPZ.
However, what this is telling me is that for an SPZ, it's not permitted, or it's a restricted discretion.
There may be another rule.
It's restricted discretionary. So what it's saying is it's not permitted,
Yes.
but it is restricted discretionary if you go to the next one down.
Sure. Okay.
And then in the column on the far right, it has a series of considerations that have to be taken into account.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we continue down those rules, including use of compost, animal effluent. Now, does animal effluent mean grazing animals in that zone?
No. It's the discharge of animal effluent to ground, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there's underneath that, Rule 15 relates to discharge of animal effluent, and that could be in a truck disposing of its, a cattle truck disposing of its load. But does animal effluent under Rule 14 mean grazing on?
No, not neither of 14 or 15. In the RRMP's policies more broadly, there is definition around that.
Okay.
So this relates to point source effectively.
Okay, so for my satisfaction, we've got this 2 kilometre zone, and when you map that there, it seemed to cover half of Hawke's Bay.
Yep.
We now have these new rules. And those rules, do they include you can't drill a well, you can't store compost, you can't have a feed lot, you can't graze animals. So we need to be clear. Well,
None of those rules apply other than to the SPZ.
okay. So going back to the SPZ map and a 2 kilometre zone, the land users in that zone will no longer be able to carry out.
No, they're effectively restricted discretionary throughout, which means that a consent is required and the council will need to evaluate, as it says in here, the actual potential effects of that activity on the drinking water supply.
Added to it, the wastewater discharge to septic tanks and the like. And I'm thinking, as an example, the water supply down in Tannery Road in Napier, which in that vicinity has, within 2 kilometres of the Jervois Town setting, which has literally hundreds of on-site wastewater discharge. Is there any impact on them? There's a feedlot across the road. There is compost stored at a business in close proximity. So I'm interested to know what the global impacts of these special zones are going to have on land users in those zones. And that needs to be clear before we put our hands up to this wonderful protection of our water supply.
So you're talking existing activities?
Both existing
yeah.
and future potential use in those zones.
And that was what I was referring to earlier about the understanding the consequences of this. But remember, with those default zones, really the only requirement is for the farm use plan to consult the water supply.
Water supply, yeah.
It's not a very onerous.
Well, you say that, but the minimum for a farm environment plan is 4 hectares. So most, I would suggest, in those zones, the majority of land users would be under 4 hectares. Uh-oh. Someone's drilling a well.
Mr. Chairman, you have to make a priority call here. You have to make a priority call here. Either we have the meeting or the drilling stops.
Somebody's just gone out. It's okay.
You're looking at the wrong chairman, mate.
Well, look, you're trying to find one who'll take control. I now know why you have co-chairs. So every time somebody comes up, you point at him.
One's asleep, which I'm watching.
So where were we, sorry?
So what does it look like for a land user in the zone? Either I'm doing something that's obviously now going to be restricted discretionary, or I'd like to do something like drill a well to water my crops. I want to put a septic tank in because that's where I live. What's it mean for me? And as we know, it's covering a significant area of the region.
So I guess one point to point out is that this has been discussed by the Tank Group, which did have representatives of farming and industrial groups, interests. And I mean, I think, you know, everyone accepted that with certain changes, this was going to be fine, it's going to work.
So I think sort of, and in that discussion and the joint working group discussion, there was discussion on some activities whether to actually prohibit, and because of some of the idiosyncrasies, actually working through a consent process that gets all those facts on the table. There's general awareness of both parties or many parties. And I think the other important part to what this plan does in many respects is also give better effect to the National Environment Standard for Drinking Water, which requires the regional council's rules to not have permitted activities that put at risk the drinking water supplies of that feed over 500 people. So some of this is actually codifying and being more explicit what's actually likely a requirement under the existing national legislation anyway.
Paper this afternoon.
I have a question. It's more a statement, really. I'm really pleased you're doing this. You know, and I think the consented vehicle will control it, some of those activities. I mean, I don't know where the feedlot is that Neil's talking about, but we don't want any feedlots in Heratonga, which is what this is about. That would just be a nonsense. In that yellow zone, I used to farm in there, and I know the country really well. Very light soils, and that's why I asked the question about the aquifer farming, because it comes in there. Very light soils tend to require nitrogen, and I've been guilty of that. So we need to be really careful about farming in that zone with high nitrogen use, because we don't want what happened in Canterbury. So I think this is really good, but I guess Neil's trying to get his handle, and I'm kind of keen as well to get my handle on what are the practical ramifications of this. And we want to protect our water supply for the next 1,000 years. And so we are going to have land use changes, there's no doubt about that, and that'll probably come through the consents. There'll be certain activities we don't want on these areas. We don't want on the plains, period. So I'm just hoping you got that right, and I understand Neil's. I'd quite like to know some of those real practical things as well, and we may not be able to get them out of this.
I'm just thinking, for the purposes of the other matters to discuss today, would it be helpful for us to go away and prepare a bit more information for that for the group, or?
Yeah, and I guess you're thinking, you Garth would know, this is light country.
Yeah.
That's why it's different from down here and down here and down here. It's all class 1C. So, okay,
Can I just
want to say something?
Sorry, can I just make one point? So we're not bringing this to a vote or recommendation now. The outcome of this presentation is reflected in the recommendations in the PC9 paper for the meeting this afternoon. Which is to recommend this. Sorry, Tony.
I just had a question for clarification. I was just trying to understand what qualifies someone to be a registered drinking water supplier, because there's no definition in version 7, and it may have been in our raft of papers, but I'm sorry I couldn't find it. What is that?
It's set out in the Health Act, 1956.
Yeah. I didn't look there.
Seriously, it's 1956, but it was amended fairly recently with the drinking water amendment, and it defines the drinking water, a registered supply. But essentially, it's a supply that is either supplying to a reticulated network, or it has a community purpose.
So I just want to hark back then to the point that was raised by Jenny around marae and papakainga, if they were captured by that definition and there needed to be a zone defined, who's going to fund the costs of that? Because I don't think that that should be borne by marae communities.
Good question.
Because you're telling me it's technical, it looks awfully technical, that's what I keep hearing. It looks awfully expensive. So what assistance will council provide to assist communities like that?
Yeah, I think that's a probably another question that's probably very pertinent, but we haven't really put a great deal of thought into that, the cost side of it.
I mean, the plan is neutral as to who provides the technical advice on the SPZ. It could be regional council. It could be funded by TPK and be a technical expert.
Well, just picking up on the vulnerable communities that I heard being mentioned, I think all these protections are great, but not great if people have these financial barriers to them.
You haven't considered it very much, but in the when we come later to the stormwater rules and policies, there is a part in a way that recognises affordability to ratepayers as one of the rules. It flabbergasts me that you know that. Yeah, it's in there. When we come to it later on, I'm surprised that it's in one part but not in another. That you're not, because to me the answer you gave to Tanya was that with these papakai and whatever, that you haven't considered who's going to fund these SPZs for them.
Sorry, Councillor, just to go back to your definition query, just on page 41, I acknowledge there's quite a bit of material, but we do have a glossary of terms, and registered drinking water supply is one of the terms that has been
Which page
clarified.
and which set of documents?
Attachment 1, page 41.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was in that one there, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just looking at referring to that glossary of terms on page 41, you've got under source protection zone, you've got the spatial extent of a source protection zone is determined by a technical method that ...
Yeah, so we're still working through that, and we talked a bit earlier about how that circle might be not quite appropriate to have as a perfect sphere. It could be,
elongated.
Yeah, so we're just trying to get a handle on the best science, I guess, for want of a better word, about how we would go about defining that method.
But you're talking about a source protection zone, which is determined by some sort of model, obviously.
Yeah.
Rather than a shape. What you're talking about in terms of turning from a circle to some sort of elongated egg shape is the PPZs.
Correct. Yes. Correct. You're talking about the default. Yeah.
So
the SPZ remains a technically defined approach.
Right, which you haven't defined the method yet for determine. Well, I thought the method was you go through and do some sort of modelling on it, because you've already got 4 of them in there.
Yeah.
So why isn't that definition, or are you intending to have that definition?
Yeah, we are intending, absolutely. Yeah. We're just finalising the words around that. Yeah.
Again, you're bringing this to the Regional Planning Committee today and asking us to take it to the next step, and you haven't got it in there.
Okay, so to contain frustration by people who want to have a say, could you please address the chair?
Oh, sorry. Sorry,
Councillor Barker.
I'm really interested in all the technical things, but I just want to ask you a simple question. From a perspective of a person who lives, outside of here, they have watched their water supply for most of their lives and their parents' lives in this area as being safe and secure, being considered to be first class. We've had one major incident, huge. So for most of our lives, we've lived with safe, secure, excellent water. One major incident, which we now need to protect ourselves of. So what I want to know from you is that all these things we're putting in place, will they secure that water in a way that's always been seen before that?
That's a question for you, Garth.
Yeah, good one.
Through you, Chair. I think the key first step in sort of working through that challenge, Councillor Barker, is we lived under a belief system that it was pure it was pristine, and there was zero risks. That belief system following that event, that terrible event, but also a massive amount of science, investigation and investment that's been made across the region, which is actually highlighted in the learnings and starting to look outside of New Zealand in the bubble and our restricted belief systems and our Hawke's Bay belief system and Heritonga Plains belief system, is it was never as good and as safe and as pristine as we believed it to be. So the modelling that we've done in terms of age profiling is we used to use statistics in an inappropriate way. So everyone talked about water beneath their feet being 30 years old or 40 years old. No one asked or no one thought of the fact that actually the water's not one age, it's various age. So we talked about from a microbiological one, any water less than a year old is risky. The new science coming in from Canada and the US and Europe is 2 years is probably the number we should think about, particularly around human sewage and effluent. So our testing has shown we've got that Frimley bore field, the latest testing, it's 70 metres down. It's well below where most of our community are pulling water from. It has 6 metre positive head, and the youngest water in that is a year old. It's just under a year.
Correct.
In Eastbourne Street, testing individual wells, and that well field's only about 500 metres, maybe 600 metres along, the water in each of the wells has a different profile. That's all new science. So I think the challenge is our belief system and the things that we hold dear as part of our bearing was actually misinformed. There is no such thing as perfect risk-free water beneath our feet. And that's very much where, so we talk about the current guidelines and that register, the health, there's work going on now around drinking water guidelines, future regulation, future Health Act stuff, future guidance. There is one likely scenario where this false pretense, or at least the branding of secure water, which is where we've all lived. I'm Hawke's Bay born and bred and proud and used to talk around the world of how wonderful it is. Actually, we cannot deliver water and say, as a matter of fact, that every single day, through every single event, it's fine. When you start monitoring it a lot, and in the peaceful times, which is all our monitoring, everything is good. But it's in the events, when there are rain events. The Wellington, the Hutt Valley Aquifer, that was also awesome and great in particular. They had an earthquake. It's not, and they've had to move their psyche. But there's also learnings in around the source protections. The reason bores, we want to know more consent. We've always looked at effects like the drawdown and is it going to drop wells in an adjacent area. What we're also looking at now is changing of hydrostatic pressure underneath, because the confining layers aren't waterproof. They're just degrees of leakiness. And the more you suck from beneath, the more you have a risk of pulling down. It's like your raincoat isn't waterproof. It only holds water back to a certain pressure. So I think our belief systems have been challenged and the science hasn't supported our historic belief system.
That's the first part. Second part, Garth?
The work that the JWG is doing is fundamental in moving the degree of comfort that people will have in water supplies in the future to a higher level. Whether they will ever be at 100% as in the past, I would say that is significantly in the future. Because this is only, the work that we're doing now in terms of the planning processes and the rules are only one further step in the multi-barrier approach. And I've got to make that point. Until changes in the Building Act, so you have backflow valves on every household, every property, so the network is actually protected. We will never have 100% guaranteed safe water. So it's something that we will be striving to. But again, there's such variability between councils and what is needed across the province. There's though an absolute commitment at that JWG working group to share information, to understand what is needed and to work cooperatively to achieve that. And so the aim is safe drinking water for everybody. But that's, how we achieve that is going to be quite a struggle. And I got asked this morning before I came here, put a number on it. Where do I think we are relative to, back to being safe? And in reality, I don't want to do that, and I sort of deliberately stayed away from that because everybody is different. But until all the component parts of this multi-barrier approach are put in place, and that's the work that the JWG is actually working on, then we will struggle to get 100% safe water. But it's the Building Act changes, and it's not only, and it's the next planning round, it's the regional plan. The tank process is only one part, but then the next phase is the actual the review of the regional plan. Again, all the other changes then have to actually come into play and actually fit together. And if we miss one of those parts, then there is always going to be a risk that in actual fact we don't end up with the right outcome.
One more question.
Excuse me, sir.
Sorry?
I did say to avoid your frustration, could you please address this?
Oh, yeah, can I just...
And what I want to say is I'll take one more question because we have other presentations to do. So,
My second question. Thank you. Could I just summarise what I think I've heard you say, what the report says? Firstly, that we lived in a mistaken world view that our water was safe, that it was by just sheer chance, really, that these things never happened before. But secondly, we're going to have to live in a world where we have to have a healthy scepticism about the quality of our water, never be falsely believe that it's 100% safe. And thirdly, to have a plan which is constantly adaptive to be able to adapt to events as they come, science and knowledge as it goes along. Is that what the proposal is here?
Absolutely, and I think Nick highlighted it. There's new science coming all the time, and we're taking that on board and then applying it and trying to apply it in a practical way. And I think that's where the rubber sort of hits the road here, is actually trying to apply it and then make it practical, as Councillor Curtin pointed out. What are the effects on the actual community to the science that we're now learning?
And the costs.
And the cost. I make the point though, as a consequence of Havelock, there was 4 deaths linked to that. And so what price do you put on that and the 2,500 people that were sick? Six. Sorry.
So given that we will be discussing this issue later, and I would rather we didn't deal with the tank matter in piecemeal fashion, we will defer the decision on it till we do our tank discussion. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Rena. And Tom, up to you who's coming in next.
Okay, so we're going to ask, so thanks very much, gentlemen, I appreciate that. So I'm going to invite Sandy and Marianne obviously didn't do anything wrong in Argentina and she's been let through by customs, so welcome back, Marianne.
We made that decision at the last meeting. Did you? Okay. I'll show you.
Now, anyone can.
Okay.
It's interesting.
I can't remember what this is. Hello, everybody. Just back from the most marvellous holiday. And I've forgotten entirely what is in the presentation, so bear with me if I'm not quite onto it this time. So this particular... we did... It was appalling, quite frankly. Had a go, had fun. Can't tango. But to more mundane matters around nutrient management and land use change, and this was one of the non-consensus items around the tank table. There was quite a bit of agreement around the overall management framework, but just how to deal with land use change was something that the group found very difficult to resolve. and it is a difficult issue because of the complexities. So, there were a number of agreements and process understandings around how to manage nutrients and the impact of nutrient loss on water quality. We had a lot of information and modelling that helped with some of those decisions, and the group, both the plenary group as well as the working group, looked at quite a few different options that would help manage land use change and nutrient loss. And we are looking at, in this meeting, looking at further direction from the RPC around how to manage the impacts of land use change. So some of the key issues that the group identified were that the values of the water bodies that we are managing are not being met by the water quality at all locations across the whole catchment. And we are managing adverse effects of point source discharges through resource consents, including the more refined approach to stormwater management that we are going to touch on later as well. But the problem really is around the cumulative adverse effects from non-point sources not being adequately managed across the catchment, and that nutrients and sediment are both key stresses for our environmental values. But there are quite significant complexities around the lag effects, both in terms of time and space, in relation to how the pathways of travel of those contaminants into water, making it very difficult then to manage across the catchment. We do know too that macrophyte growth in the lowland rivers affect water quality. We don't have complete information about how to manage particularly nutrient loss and the allocation limits or the sustainable amounts of nutrient that the system can cope with across the various water bodies. And we know too that land use change can alter the state of water quality. But as I said, the tank group did come to a number of agreements, including a very significant one around the desired water quality state for the different water bodies across the catchment. They also agreed that further improvements for some of the attributes is necessary, and they're looking also at a longer-term approach, so that looking at short-term objectives as well as longer-term objectives. And they did agree too that the state of some of the water bodies did require further attention. And it was also clear that one size was not going to fit all of the one solution was not going to fit all of the problems that the various water bodies might have had across the catchment. The group also agreed that development of a property nutrient allocation regime would depend on better information to make it a more accurate and defensible allocation regime. So that was particularly in relation to the appropriate catchment load limits that we didn't have enough science around to determine specifically, and that we would need better information to support the development of an equitable nutrient allocation methodology. There were agreements around particular mitigation measures that were known to be successful. So things like stock exclusion and riparian planting farm plans are known to be successful in meeting water quality outcomes. So there was a focus on identifying mitigation measures. And there was also an agreement that a priority approach was necessary, so that where water quality wasn't being met, there would be a priority management approach to those areas, and that there would be a focus on the stresses and the pathways that had the biggest effect on improving ecosystem health and water quality. So there was widespread agreement too for the need for a farm plan approach, so that those risks at a property scale could be identified and mitigation measures adopted at a property scale, and that farm plans would eventually be required across all catchments, but that we would focus on a priority order where water quality outcomes weren't being met. And there were additional set of rules that were agreed on around particular activities. So we had specific setbacks specific setback requirements, and things like land disturbance rules. There was also a lot of discussion around how to manage land use change, which we'll come to a little bit more, and that review and monitoring are also critical aspects of this plan change. And there was just a reference to some of the policies that are relevant there. So the decisions still required by the RPC are around the threshold for a consent requirement around land use change, so that the effects of a land use change could be assessed according to the location and the possible impact on water quality as a result of that land use change. And there was also some debate around the establishment of a property scale nutrient allowance regime or allocation regime. And there was an indication here that in the draft 7, that it would be as a consequence or as this plan was reviewed. So it would be a 10-year time frame rather than within the 10 years that this would be developed. This is really just showing how the group worked towards the framework that is in this draft 7, and it looked at, the group looked at the attribute states, so what kind of water quality was necessary, and also looked at working with landowners to understand what kind of things would be necessary to meet the targets or the states that were set by the tank group. So we worked quite a lot with the farmer reference group and gave them the challenge of saying, well, if the requirement is to reduce sediment loss by 30%, how would that be achieved? And followed the similar process with the working group, the tank working group, around meeting the outcomes for nutrient loss reductions. So the outcome was really an acknowledgement of the importance of good farm stewardship, and that the outcomes were important to be understood, so that landowners and farmers knew what it was they had to do, knew what it was in relation to outcomes that were being sought by the community. So they were specified in terms of water quality outcomes. Yes, I'm not sure if I can add a lot more to that at this stage. But there are a lot of uncertainties around how we manage some of the water quality challenges, and particularly in relation to the interactions and the complexities in the relationships between the contaminants of concern and the ecosystem health. They're complex, they're location specific, they're sometimes not very certain, and they're not entirely understood or accurately quantifiable. And that's particularly in relation to understanding the sustainable load that the estuaries can cope with. And it's seldom possible to predict the exact outcome in terms of the water quality state in relation to the mitigation measures, particularly in relation to timeframes, and thinking especially around sediment management, which can take the time lags and the locations of the pathways of the sediment from the land to the water are variable and really difficult to understand in a lot of detail. So timeframes are difficult to assess in terms of when outcomes are going to be met. This was just to, when did you want to leap in? I can't remember. This was a slide that Sandy prepared, and it was really just to illustrate more specifically the complexities of the natural ecosystems that we're working in, particularly in the lowland streams where macrophyte growth is stimulated by nutrients, because we use nutrients to make plants grow. But in terms of ecosystem health, the stresses in those catchments are more around dissolved oxygen and temperature than they are around nutrients. So it was important to understand what kind of mitigation measures were necessary in order to improve the state of those ecosystems. And it wasn't necessarily concentrating on the amount of nutrient in those waterways. It was more looking at how we can manage the macrophytes and therefore reduce or improve the dissolved oxygen and reduce the temperatures. I'm not sure that's relevant. We'll just skip that one. So there were a lot of uncertainties that we need to think about in dealing with particularly nutrient management. The complexities, the relationships, the uncertainties, and adaptive or program management can help cope with those uncertainties. And we do know some things. We know that soil conservation erosion control will reduce soil loss, which improves water clarity and turbidity. It reduces the deposited sediment in the waterways, and it improves the MCI, macroinvertebrates. Stock exclusion, we know that's really successful in reducing the amount of bank erosion. It improves ecosystem health. The ecosystem health reduces the amount of contaminant loss from stock and stock excess. Shading reduces macrophyte growth. So we know things, we know relationships. We don't always know the quantity, but we know the relationships. And we know that nutrients make plants grow.
Senakoto Katua. Good morning, everyone. So I jump in now just trying to explain the decisions that the tank group made in terms of attributes and the values to protect the values in the different tributaries and where we are meeting and where we are not meeting and need management. So first of all, there was we've got a whole set of guidelines that tell us if there is good water quality or not, and the pool that we could choose from, the thresholds of the guidelines, are first of all the NPS, which is mandatory, of course. So the National Objectives Framework gives us for rivers 4 attributes that we have to manage. And that is the E. coli, toxicity in ammonia and nitrate, and the algal biomass. So these are the ones that we have to manage as soon as they fall below a bottom line, or we can decide on a certain band or attribute state. Then we've got the resource management plan, of course, and the NZEC guidelines, Australian New Zealand guidelines for fresh and marine water quality. But then also what we could pick, because it still didn't cover all the attributes that would indicate if our values that the tank group decided on were protected or not. So what was there as well were proposed scientific papers proposed for the NOF threshold. So they already had bands in terms of excellent water quality or excellent state, good state, fair state or poor state. But they didn't make it to the NOF yet. They were still in discussion, but that's at least a threshold that gives us a connection between the value and the attribute state. And then science papers as well that directly relate between an indicator or an attribute and the how well the value is protected. So these are all thresholds and guidelines that have different relevance to the values for different zones in our tank catchments. And that comes up to about 70 numeric values that we could pick from, which means we needed some decision criteria to pick the right guideline that is of most relevance to protect the values. So first of all, of course, the NOF framework gives us these 4 attributes that were the toxicity, E. coli, and algal biomass. And then secondly, any attribute that gives us a direct link to a value, that directly says this is the concentration or the threshold that we would have a 99% species protection or 95% species protection, or this is a good or excellent state. If we don't have a link like that to an attribute, we can fall back onto a statistical guideline. These statistical guidelines just tell us this is the normal range. If you're outside of that range, then you should investigate. This is kind of a trigger value that makes you investigate what's going wrong. And then the fourth one is if we've got several attributes or several values with the same indicator or attribute, then we would pick the most critical one, obviously, the ones that is the critical value that automatically includes other values as well. For example, in turbidity and clarity, we've got trout fishery as well as recreational guidelines, and then we would pick the more stringent one, and then it protects both values. One. So these were the decision criteria for picking the guidelines.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chair? Can I just ask a quick question? So just in terms of guidelines, what about consumptive values in relation to taonga species and guidelines around whether, for example, tuna are safe to eat? Which of the guidelines that you've identified would help with that? I know there's an American guideline that looks at contaminants and cumulative aspects as well, and frequency and of harvesting and eating, that kind of thing. But is there anything like that in here, given a lot of the water quality issues will impact on mahinga kai?
If there is, so this is a problem because that is one point that is missing here. First of all, we were discussing where we have also data on what the state is, and we wouldn't have that for mahinga kai at this point in time. So we would fall back. We would have to go back and either to ANZAC guidelines in terms of fish toxicity values or anything like that. So this is not something that we could discuss a state of because we don't have the data. We don't have measurements for that. So we would have guidelines in there that could come in, that default guidelines that would be in the ANZAC guidelines anyway in terms of toxicity. But that is...
My understanding of those ANZAC type guidelines is that they're not... they don't really cater for a community that consumes things like tuna, because it doesn't really, those guidelines don't focus on cumulative aspects. So where you've got a discrete population that might harvest tuna, eat tuna more regularly than most people, and you don't have the right guidelines for being able to measure the impacts of that. So I'm just asking, given mahinga kai will be one of those important aspects, do the guidelines that we're looking at track through and support whether mahinga kai will be, whether what we're doing is going to be sufficient to ensure that mahinga kai are safe?
Yes, since we don't have these guidelines and we don't have data, that would have to be something that needs to be investigated in a targeted study and just picked up in investigations, because that's not, presently there are no guidelines for that.
Although, as well as that, the E. coli standards are relevant, so in terms of bacterial effects on the health of being able to harvest it safely, and also the stormwater controls, because a lot of the toxic metals, the sort of urban contaminants, they can be quite, they can accumulate in the mahinga kai. So our improved stormwater regime would address that. A lot of those contaminants that accumulate are more likely to be as a result of a discharge. So we've got some requirements around meeting species protection levels as if there is a consent being assessed. So that's also a protection for the health of the mahinga kai.
So I guess I'm just trying to see, do the guidelines look right through to the end consumer, if you like? Because from what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like, it sounds like we've got guidelines to talk about toxicity in relation to
keep them alive.
Species. There is that, versus what actually, it's not just that tuna are plentiful and abundant or whatever, it's also can they be harvested safely? Yeah.
So there is some, as Sandy said, there are some gaps around the knowledge for the health of the species for eating, but certainly in terms of the impact of discharges on those species, the ANZAC guidelines are something that we would look to manage the direct or direct discharges. Yeah.
Can I just flag now then that it would be good to know how will that gap be filled as part of this plan?
It's probably a gap that is relevant across the whole of New Zealand, and it's not something that I think this council will be addressing on its own, because it's a relevant concern across the whole of New Zealand. So it's something that we would need to keep in touch with our colleagues around New Zealand as well.
I'm sorry, why isn't this council responsible for ensuring that Mahunga Kai is fit for consumption?
That's not,
If that's one of our attributes of the plan, why aren't we actually fulfilling that attribute?
well, we are. It's the science burden, I suppose, in terms of gathering the information, developing standards to fill the gap that Sandy referred to. That's quite a significant.
So we've got an attribute that we're not going to be able to fulfil because we haven't got the science to put any measurement around it.
We're still protecting the water quality that protects the health of the Mahunga Kai.
You may have missed something while you were on holiday. There was hundreds of eels that died in the creek here in Napier.
Yes.
20 actually. So, I mean, science is only empirical observation. So there's countless examples in newspapers about eels dying. I mean, we had the Tūtere incident. We've had this one here. We've had lots. So I don't accept that excuse that there's no science.
Observation tells you that.
And maybe there needs to be a discussion with Tangata Whenua, because we have lots of science on these matters.
I think just to clarify for the committee, what's being said is that overall water quality is being protected and therefore habitat for Mahunga Kai is protected, and we have a broad set of science to support that, and obviously proposed policies and rules in the plan that support that. The absolute specifics of absolutely each and every species of interest to Mahunga Kai and a range of different habitat and what absolutely specific provisions you might want to protect each and every one of those is science that's not yet completed. So there's absolutely no suggestion here that this plan is not protecting Mahunga Kai. It is. I think the question is the extent to which that we've got science with precision to take the rules and policies to an even greater level of specificity.
So
You can come up with a number of 30% for sediment loss without any science, because that's just a stab in the dark and throwing a dart in the dartboard.
Yep.
So, I mean, one hand, you're prepared to go, right, we'll just take a stab in the dark to do that, and the other hand, it doesn't seem to me like you are.
So, Councillor, would you like to suggest what Mahunga Kai species we might have in mind and what sort of provisions we might put in place to protect those? I mean, this is the point. I suspect you won't, because nobody does, and I think the point that's being made here is there are a set of policies and rules in the plan that provide an overall level of environmental protection, and that's as good as it's going to get based on current knowledge and science at the national level.
then could you include a broad statement that includes that these protections include Mahunga Kai?
Well, I think that's well and truly within the plan as currently drafted.
Yeah.
I just
Then
think
what's missing is how you propose to check that out.
I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that this has been a long period of neglect by this council in terms of doing the work that should have been done, because the concerns have been raised for over 100 of years about the fact that we can no longer, eat our prippies over here at West Shore, right through the Tiawanga. We no longer be able to access our freshwater crayfish, our flounders, all sorts. There's a whole range of things, I mean, those are all well documented in lots of historical documents and scientific documents that have been sent in by Māori people of this region. So I just think that there needs to be some resource put together to ensure it happens.
So, Co-Chair, this is precisely what is laid out extensively in the front end of the plan change, is the acknowledgement of the chronic degradation of the freshwater resources of the tank catchments and those impacts on values, including cultural values and the ability for people to exercise their customary rights. All those things are set out, and the plan is all about addressing those.
Well, you appeared to express some confusion earlier, in clarity about what species need to be looked at. So I don't accept defensive arguments. I just want something to happen. We all want something to happen.
And the sooner this plan is
Chairman,
notified and
Mr.
operative,
Chair.
something will happen.
Mr. Chair. Many times over the years, tuna has always been raised. Eels, not trout. We don't care about trout, just tuna. You just mentioned the coda, the crayfish. We can go and find them in the nice clean rivers. They're there, they're living. But we keep that a secret to ourselves. But tuna, they're everywhere. If you can't drink the water, you don't dare eat the fish. Or you'd have to boil the living hell out of it. So it's very, very simple. They are the main things, clean the water for the tuna. We should be serving it here and just see how it goes. Might be clean out for everybody.
So,
Chair, thank you.
So I just wanted to bring it back to my original question was, when we're looking at the guidelines which guide what rules, etc., we put in place, my concern is to understand that those guidelines that we're looking at actually address the issue of concern to tangata whenua. So the issues range from the health of the awa, the quality of the water, etc. But one of the other issues is mahinga kai, and I'm not just talking about the place, which is what that means effectively, mahinga kai. I'm talking about the actual activity of harvesting and consuming. And do our guidelines assist us to have confidence that the rules we're putting in place are going to get us to that end eventually? Because otherwise we're not measuring the right thing. That's what I'm worried about. And what I've heard about the Australia and New Zealand guidelines is that, well, what I've heard from health is that they don't have exact guidelines for kaimoana or freshwater species in terms of consumption. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the New Zealand standards don't look at a cumulative, from a cumulative perspective, where you have a community consuming over time. So their exposure to contaminants and things like that is greater, and so you want to be taking care around that when you're actually setting limits or whatever. So I wanted to raise that question because obviously from all the values reports, without me having read all of them, that is what whānau will be talking about, is not just the water, but is the end result there that the tuna will be better off such that we can harvest and consume. I'm just trying to see where's the look through. If there's gaps, then can we please signal at some point, well, how are we going to deal with this? Because we can't wait for the country to catch up with us. We've got a job to do. That's what I hear everyone's here to do. So what is the answer? So that's what I'm looking for.
And it's about making the water quality of a standard that meets the needs of the values. And one of the values identified is mahinga kai. So the attributes that are supported by science development around appropriate guideline levels, they will improve the water quality so that mahinga kai is also protected or and can be harvested.
So the policies and rules reduce sediment loading, and there's an aim of obviously 30%. We know sediment's the master stressor for eels as well as other aquatic fish, so dealt with that. There's obviously stock exclusion required throughout the catchment in terms of getting animals out of waterways, reducing obviously stream bank erosion. There's a whole program of riparian fencing and planting for shading, providing greater habitat. So all of those things, plus the other controls on things like improved stormwater performance, that's in the other parts of the policy being considered today, as well as the flow regimes and all those sorts of things, all cumulatively will provide substantially better habitat and therefore the ultimate conclusion must be that there's improved Mahinga Kai performance.
I don't know, I'm just asking the question.
Yes, so the answer to your question is yes, it will substantially do so. Our ability to predict that there will be, 480 tonnes as opposed to 300 tonnes of eel available, for Mahinga Kai collection in the Ngāraroa on a given year, in 5 years hence is impossible. Obviously, there are a huge range of variables. Collectively, you have to satisfy yourselves that this package of measures does meet the national policy requirements, the RMA requirements and the community's aspirations to get the improved water quality that gives better Mahinga Kai outcomes. And what we're telling you, certainly from a staff perspective, and I think the view of the Tank Group as well, is collectively the package achieves just that.
I think what this conversation has shown me is that the call for us to have core competencies in Mātauranga Māori is an integral part of our staff training. It needs to happen sooner than later, otherwise all the answers to these questions that have been asked would have been accommodated.
Well, Co-Chair, can I just make the point that the policy, as drafted, recognises all of the things that have been raised and is accommodated. We're just talking about the limits of science in terms of precision within the policy. Nobody is anywhere disputed the primacy of tangata whenua interests in this. It is throughout the document. It is clear that protecting Mahinga Kai and achieving the aspirations of tangata whenua is absolutely paramount, and the degradation of the environment is absolutely acknowledged. Nobody is doubting that. So I'm at a loss to understand why you think there is some deficit in understanding of the importance of cultural values and of this plan achieving those.
I think I know why there's doubt. It's because of the last 50 odd years. But going forward, what highlights to me is the value of monitoring, because we've been told this every plan change, to be honest, around Mahinga Kai. So it's really hard to maintain a level of optimism. Mm-hmm. So a monitoring document that we can see that checks and measures gradual improvement over time would be critical to the plan change, to have some faith in the process.
Totally agree, and I think that's consistent with what this plan is designed to be, which is adaptive. And we recognise that there are a whole lot of uncertainties about what the outcomes will ultimately be, and so it's full of best endeavours based on best available science. And we will, when we review the plan, no doubt have learned some things from the monitoring that you refer to, and there'll be areas in which we, will need to make some changes.
So one step beyond the monitoring, it seems to me, back to the agenda item here, is the degree to, and the area of disagreement is the degree to which the plan can identify and recognize land use change that could exacerbate the situation. That's the other step in the process. That's where we have to come to some conclusion at this point, because, as has been said, there's an entire plan sitting in front of us that addresses the broader issues and sets the standards and so forth. The area of so if you either accept that or you don't, and then you move on and say, well, okay, let's make sure we're keeping track of it effectively. So the monitoring is important, but will the plan permit something to happen that we don't want to permit to happen, which is land use activities and practices that would worsen the situation? And the degree to which we tackle that is what we have to address here, and how interventionist or how property specific or whatever are we in trying to get our arms around that potential future development. Is that, so I'd like to hear what disagreement existed. There's a recommendation as to how far to go down that path. What's the recommendation, and what disagreement exists around it?
So would I.
In other words, why was there no consensus?
Yeah.
I think the reason why there was no consensus is that we are working in an environment where we don't have all the information we need. And so it was trying to work out how best to identify land use change. And in the paper I mentioned that land use change can take many forms. We don't have a definition of land use change. It can be a change from sheep to beef and beef to sheep. That's kind of within system changes that could impact. Or you could have a change from, say, pastoral to dairy farming, or you could have a change from vegetable growing to grape growing. Not all of the changes are negative. So developing a rule around land use change was actually technically very difficult to do. So it wasn't so much that there was a disagreement that we needed some measures in the plan or some regulation around land use change. It was the form that they took that was difficult. And so the proposition in the version 7 was around a 20 kilogram per hectare per year limit. And that created a whole lot of disagreement and debate around, well, what's the implication of that? So we were looking at a different way of setting up a threshold, and looked more at a threshold based on the load across a property, based on the permitted baseline, as it were. So the suggestion now is that we look at 170 kilograms per year as the threshold for land use change.
Over what area?
Just the property itself.
No matter how big the property,
Yeah.
170 would trigger a change.
So, sorry, Chair, through you, Chair. What I'd really like to know, Mary Ann, is that's what was in contention. That's why you didn't read consensus, because it's complicated and everything else. What I would like to know, what were the arguments used by each party to come to that conclusion? Because if you're having a consensus using a consensus decision making model, one of the key things is that when there's a disagreement, is that everyone should know why everyone's disagreeing. And if you can't tell me why people disagreed with a particular proposition that was put before you, that's what I'd like to know. What did they actually disagree with? Why were they concerned about it?
It was the use of 20 kilograms per hectare per year as the threshold was seen as there was a risk that it was a limit that people could increase losses up to.
So it becomes a target. It was a clumsy and probably ineffective way of setting a threshold for saying once losses increase above 20, we need to know about them. So that was really the main area of disagreement around the use of that particular threshold.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, losses of what?
Nitrogen losses, yeah, is the key contaminant. The management of phosphorus was seen to be most effective through the management of sediment, because in most places in the catchment, sediment would bind to your, phosphorus binds to the sediment.
I'm still trying to get my head around what you're saying, because that any change. Because you've gone from this what was in draft 7, rule 4A, any change to a production land use activity commencing after date that results in an increase in annual nitrogen loss of more than 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and then you've jumped to one which is 170 kilograms
across the property. It's not a per hectare rate.
Is that effectively a materiality threshold in terms of the catchment load?
No.
How do you strike 170?
Well, it was looking at what the baselines were. So we had a requirement for farm plans at 4 hectares, and then looking at the range of land uses that are possible on that, looking at the sort of maximum permissible change within that 4 hectares came to 170. So it was using the baselines, the permitted baselines, to develop the 170.
Right. Okay, so if we're looking at the new proposed Rule 4, where 4B, where it goes at the end, where it talks about the 170 kilograms per year, it's not clear from reading that rule that it is actually over a property. That just a wording thing that we need to tidy up?
I'd have to check that. I haven't got it in front of me, but it could well be.
So it's tougher per hectare than the 20 kilo on properties over 8 or 9 over 9 hectares. So for any property over 9, the 170 total was, so for most big blocks, the 170 is tougher than the 20.
Yeah. Now that I'm aware that that's the measure, because that wasn't clear at all, and sitting there reading these things and getting all confused about that.
Mr. Chairman, is that actually practical? Regardless of the size of the property, say that this will be the trigger.
Seems strange.
It's also linked to the farm plan requirements and the reporting through the farm plan of land use changes. So we get a source of information from those farm plans that will help identify where there is a possible change to the losses that might exceed the 170. Whether or not it's practical still remains to be seen.
Like all of these things, there will be a significant compliance exercise around both ensuring that farm plans accurately record what is happening on farm, and then obviously monitoring whether changes in land use differ from what's being reported, and making sure that people are seeking resource consent when they are in breach of the thresholds here. So, but this is part and parcel with all the rules in this. There's a massive compliance exercise to go through yet, and we'll certainly in future long-term plans, once this plan's operative, be going back to councillors and to ratepayers for additional resourcing to implement all of this. That's the track we're on, region-wide freshwater reform.
How much consensus is there on this 170?
So, to echoing Councillor Curtin's question about in the last issue area, would this plan permit me as a farmer or grower to change my farming practice or change my system or what I grow in such a way that increased my nutrient load from my property? Would it permit me to do that or not?
Yes, and the rate at which, this is just a trigger for a consent, so presumably post-consent there could be allowances for greater increases, so this is the trigger point. There may or may not, that'll fall into discretion by the consenting process here in council. But the extent to which you can increase without the trigger depends on the size of your property under the 170 kilo proposal. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a relatively small property, you'll be able to increase a bit. If you've got a very large property, only a little.
So what was studiously avoided in the debate was trying to identify particular crops or farming systems or what have you that represented, quote, greater risk in terms of their potential impact on the environment. Similarly, an avoidance of attempting to identify farming systems or practices that might consume more water per output than other activities. So I think what we need to be clear about is that we have refrained from going down that path and are trying to adopt sort of mid-range, it seems to me, kind of mid-range protections that offer a fair amount of protection that we're not going to worsen the situation. But we're not guaranteeing that we can't worsen the situation on a property-by-property basis. Is that fair?
The slight twist I'd put on it is the emphasis here is therefore on larger properties, and we're sort of triaging out smaller.
And sensitive areas.
Yeah, because if we try to capture every property at every scale, then obviously we create an undue compliance burden both on landowners and on the council.
Was there anybody who argued that we should have a plan that tries to capture this property by property, or regulate this property by property?
There's still a little bit of detail to sort through, and the 170 kilograms per year was developed with a lot of input, particularly from Port New Zealand and Beef and Lamb. But there are still some questions around what we mean by, and it's relevant in terms of the way the rule is worded, what is land use change, that we probably still need to spend a bit of time thinking about what does that mean, given that within the plains particularly, the pattern of land use changes all the time. And it's difficult to keep track of. There will be big compliance issues around how we understand what is happening on the plains as particularly rotationally grazed or rotationally cropped land changes across the plains as well. So there's still going to be quite difficult technical challenges to work through as we develop the rule further, but it's trying to get some guidance from the committee as to is this the approach that you want to see develop further in version 8 of the plan, or are you looking for some different mechanism to manage land use change?
I'd like to follow up on Councillor Belford's question and lead it with the saying that if it's not measured, it's not managed. So unless we know what's going on property by property, we're not going to be able to observe the trends and monitor our water consumption. So one of the recent trends is the pulling out of grapes and the land being put into apples. You're at the back of Taradale, it's happening all out there, over Havelock the same. So, and that's going to mean at least a doubling of water consumption. So we need to have systems in place whereby we can measure, we can manage.
So that will come through the mandatory, well, the farm plans required in the,
Can I just,
in the plan, and so just to be clear, Co-Chair, under the policies it is proposed that there will be reporting on a property by property basis. So we'll not know what this is the question around
nobody answered it.
whether consents are required for land use change.
Can I just ask a question on, you're relying on the environment management plans to, the farm plans to provide you with that set of information and monitor. So the minimum is 4 hectares?
Yep, that's what's proposed.
Minimum 4 hectares.
No, 10, I think. 10 hectares.
Minimum 10 hectares?
So is that for the requirement for farm plans, or is that?
Consents. No, that's in here. 10 hectares. That's the land use change rule.
10 hectares?
Yeah.
Yes. So you're looking at, in certain locations throughout the plain, if you look at the titles, if you like, even if they're titles are owned by a single owner, we'll have significant numbers of properties under 10 hectares, but their aggregate is substantial. I appreciate the focus on large properties, and that's obvious. But what are the implications for smaller parcels of land that, in fact, may be multiply land use may be under a singular management? So what are the implications of the 10 hectare threshold for the catchment?
So my understanding is that they're not based on parcel size, so it's not on title blocks. It'll be as per PC6 and Tukituki, farming enterprise based. So
we use the same definition.
Aggregated up.
Oh, yeah.
So it's on the owner.
Yeah.
It's on the farming business, if you like.
Farm business?
Now, if you were really tricky and you wanted to get around all of this, you could set up probably 15 different companies and have them running different titles within the same business.
This is my point.
But that would be pretty challenging, I think, for someone to...
Well, I think...
Well, it's happening already in Central Hawke's Bay, so...
The point I'm making is we've got some significant land use on properties and businesses which are under 10 hectares, particularly in Heritonga, intensive horticulture use, etc. So we've got significant areas where that rule doesn't apply, and I'm interested to know what are the implications of that if we're not in fact measuring or considering management of land where we don't have jurisdiction under the plan.
We would probably understand the impact of that better if we modelled losses and land use change at that scale, but we actually don't have that information. So the number of properties that are smaller than 10 to 20, we haven't done that analysis.
I'm just concerned. The question here in front of us is how we're going to manage land use change. That's the question. And my concern is we don't know enough about those land uses, and the change in land use is rapid, and it's diverse. It's across the whole. I mean, it can be as simple as changing from sheep to cattle, or changing within that we could go to, say, a bull beef grazing, which is quite a much more intensive activity. So are we asking the regional council to be monitoring something that has no show of actually monitoring and consenting?
There was quite a bit of support from the various industry groups to help devise some text in, and I think it's Schedule 3, which is currently empty, to give a little bit more information around what kind of land use changes we would be looking at. Schedule 4, sorry. To provide some more guidance so that we can implement Rule 4, or 4A as it is now. So that might be a way of providing, or at least keeping track of, the kinds of changes that we're looking at. So get a little bit more definition around land use change as it pertains to the rotation, the cropping rotations that occur regularly. So that we wouldn't count as land use change per se, but we might define land use changed in relation to a change in the ratio of stock, for instance. So if it changes to a significant level from sheep to beef, that would be a land use change. So that was the role of the Schedule 4, is to help understand what kind of land use changes we would be targeting through the rule, and we would pick up and monitor that through the farm plans.
Yeah, my concern in this is it's almost as if we're trying to we're trying to scoop out the scoop water up with a net. It's almost an impossibility, and I'm wondering whether in fact your option 1, 20 kg per hectare, or your 170 kilos per year are in fact redundant before we even start. In fact, we should be considering option 4, that we actually don't have direct regulation of land use change per se. We only have regulation of land use.
So more like option C, which is being specific about what activity is going to occur where.
Yeah, 3 or 4.
Yeah, so that's a another huge body of work, obviously, to define and to justify through the RMA Schedule 1 process what activities and their effects should be regulated where, and that's very, very prescriptive regulation, and I would say to you is not entirely consistent with an effects-based approach.
It was something we actually did have a go at doing with the Farmer Reference Group, is to list the activities, and we ended up going down a little bit of a rabbit hole, because the more you try and do that, the more definitional issues you have and the thresholds that you need to develop, and it made it actually way more complex and difficult, and was put to one side as not being workable.
Exactly. How would you characterize our knowledge of current land use on the plains? Would you say we are, we have a granular understanding of it? Do we have it seems to me when we work up economic projections of what the cost of regulation might be, we come up with these fantastic economic models down to the dollars and cents. It's going to cost this much if you're a bean farmer, and this much if you're a grape grower, and God forbid we add these costs on as a consequence of regulation, and yet when we turn around and ask the question, well, do we know enough to effectively regulate? Well, we don't know anything. So do we know, it does seem like there's a bit of a,
I think it's the property scale question.
a double standard here.
At broad scale, we do, and there was information in the broader pack around, the number of hectares and onions, and the number of hectares and peas and those sorts of things. So we've got some large broad figures, but obviously land use changes on a paddock by paddock basis, year to year, and even within the year, multiple crops changing, all those sorts of things, and we can't track that under our current systems. So it is fairly broad brush. And, I think PC6 has shown us that we can get farm environment plans with associated nutrient budgets for most large properties, and we can get those in the door, and we can then get into the business of monitoring changes to those. There are effectively land use change rules because of the caps that exist, the end caps that exist in Plan Change 6. But it will get incredibly challenging in the fullness of time when we're debating in court the validity of overseer models and all those sorts of things, and scientists versus scientists, which is why this is an inherently incredibly difficult area of regulation nationally. And this is a kind of best attempt at creating a bit of a triage, getting into the door a consent application for large-scale change that's going to have a big impact.
I guess where that leads me personally is, I would like to see the Plan B as demanding as it possibly could be in terms of what we're asking people to report and what we're trying to measure based on those reports, because that's what everybody seems to want a great deal more certainty about. And our DHB fellow said he wants us to have a Plan B if, on the basis of all that monitoring reporting, we don't feel we're making adequate progress toward our goals. And if the more rigor that is put in place in terms of what we are trying to have farmers, growers report, or land users report, the more rigor there is there, the more relaxed I would be about the need to intervene and regulate today in this plan what they're doing or not doing. So I can accept that we're not going to say this is a preferred activity on the plains, although there's some people who would like to see us say, give that hierarchy. I'm prepared to say, no, I'm not ready to go that far, but I sure as hell, if I'm going to give up on that, I want to be damn sure that we're going to know, in relatively short order, what is happening on every square inch of the Haratunga Plains, so that we can make that judgment if we need to in 5 years, 10 years. Is that too much to ask?
That's quite a lot. I just want to does this, Chair, through you, this essentially says that there's the use of nitrogen as a measurement to restrict some activities, because it will.
It's not the use of nitrogen, it's the amount that's being
is lost. The loss of nitrogen, well, that's use and loss. Because actually, it's actually not a bad way of doing it, because you will achieve some of those objectives that Tom's trying to achieve, because we all know some crops and some activities, not crops necessarily, but some activities use a whole lot more nitrogen, and they won't be able, and they'll have loss, and they won't be able to participate on the plains. So it's not. I think it's not a bad. If you can get it right, and you can actually monitor the loss, which is a challenge within itself.
Well, we can't. We rely on overseer to predict a loss as a result of a land management activity.
And that comes down to soil type and all other. An overseer does that pretty well, does it?
Well, as James mentioned, there are issues around the use of overseer in a regulatory sense because of all the uncertainties and the dynamic.
And does that come down to the farmers giving you the right information?
No, I saw a presentation from California, And the professor was illustrating the nitrogen cycle, and it's really complex. If you look above the ground and what we know, and if you look in the soil and you look in the pathways, and there were arrows everywhere. And his point in his presentation was we should not be writing regulations on the basis of so many arrows, because it's just too complex to predict accurately. So we should focus on what we do know, which is inputs and outputs, and we know water quality. So those are where we need to focus our attention. And we know some land uses do have, according to Overseer, a predicted higher level of loss than others. So we know some land uses are more risky than other land uses. And those are the ones that we need to perhaps keep a closer eye on. And there was a point made about monitoring, and we are actually getting better science, better tools to monitor land use change. And I don't know if you've had a presentation from Dr. Barry Lynch around satellite imagery that is increasingly sophisticated, so we can tell the difference between a carrot crop and a beetroot crop, apparently. So we are getting better monitoring tools that will help us understand what land use change at that broader kind of catchment scale is as well, to support what we're doing at a property scale through farm plans.
Councillor Bailey.
But taking your observations to one, its obvious conclusion is what we're doing here is choosing only one arrow, the nitrogen arrow, as a default for everything else. And we're making an assumption that that's going to get us where we want to go. And I'm starting to, in my mind, sort of walk back from that to say, in fact, we're trying to catch the wind. This in 10 years' time is unlikely, no matter how precise we get with our observation of nitrogen use or loss, we're unlikely to achieve the result. And are we better to adopt a different sort of pathway?
But that's not the only thing that's being measured. There's a whole raft of things.
Well, this is the land use change that we've got here. It's nitrogen.
Now, Councillor Bailey, please, again.
Oh, no, thank you, Chair. The issue of the property or farming enterprise, I'd just like a better explanation of that, because I would, to my thinking, because in the description you talk about the farm properties or farming enterprises in the tank catchments, but if we're trying to improve the Ngātaruo, when someone's got a property by the Ngātaruo and one by the, I don't know, the Karamill or something like that, is that, and they're both inside the tank catchment, and the one on the Ngātaruo is I don't know, doing a feedlot or something bizarre, you know, something that leaches a whole lot of nitrogen, versus the one that's over in the other catchment is quite benign. Is that how does that actually improve the Ngātaruo versus doing nothing and, you know, being benign in the Karami?
I'm not sure if I understand your question exactly, but what we're looking at is identifying where the water quality is not what it should be, and focusing our attention in terms of priority catchments. And if the priority catchment is one that's not meeting nitrogen limits, for example, then properties in that catchment will be required to understand more about their nitrogen management. So it's dealing with the cumulative impact of all of those land uses in priority catchments.
So where's that in Rule 4?
So that would be in relation to the priority catchment schedule. So Schedule 3, I don't know if you've got that in your papers, but it's in version 7.
Whereabouts in version 7?
Yeah.
Page
3.
68 of those papers.
Right, okay.
So if you're in a catchment that isn't meeting water quality for one of the attributes, you would need to make sure that your plan, your farm plan, identified what the risks were and what the mitigation measures
Yep.
you need to identify.
And that's fine. We're talking about land use change, right? Because that's what Rule 4's about.
Yeah.
But if you've got one property that's in a high priority area, and you've got one property that's in a low priority area, you are taking them as a farming enterprise as one whole.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are going to change, and if you've got a farm that's in a high priority area and you're going to change it from apples to intensive dairying or something, and you're taking another property away from, that's in a low priority area and you're changing it from, I don't know, dairying to sheep grazing or something bizarre like that, that's unders and overs, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. There are two things going on. One is improving water quality where it's not meeting the standards, which is your priority catchments and your farm plan approach. The other issue is land use change, and that's across all of the catchments. So that's where the rule applies. It doesn't matter if you're in a low or a high priority catchment. Land use change in its own terms is something that Rule 4A is trying to manage.
Well, if you're taking it, I mean, again, you've got high priority catchments and low priority catchments. If you've got a farming enterprise which is spread across both catchments, and you have a land use change in the high priority catchment which increases the nitrogen load, coming out, you can offset it. You could offset it by decreasing the nitrogen load coming off the low priority catchment. How is that going to help the high priority catchment?
But could you do that? Don't the catchment plans apply to a catchment, not to the property, to the catchment. So it has to be within the catchment. Just because you have land over the hill and somewhere else doesn't mean to say you can trade that for the land on the other side.
Can I just clarify, you're talking about a farm enterprise that covers two different catchments?
You're the most disruptive bunch I've ever cheered. You know?
Well, you know, for example, Johnny Bostock has got.
I'll be closing this meeting very shortly.
I think it's around the definition for farm enterprise that the issue is, and I can't actually recall the definition.
If it mirrors PC6, then you can't overs and unders out of different subcatchments.
No.
So there are zones.
And that would give me a lot more comfort if that was really clear in there.
Yep.
Because that's at the moment it's not. Because inside a particular a zone or subcaption, however we end up doing that, that's fine.
Of course.
I get that.
Yep.
So thank you very much for your delivery, and we've got half an hour for lunch until our next official meeting starts. So if you have any further questions of the team, I'm sure they'll be around. Thank you.
Can I have just a very quick meeting with councillors on port-related matters up in the Mohaka room now, just quickly before we break for lunch?
I've got another point.
Hey, union guy might talk to my delegate.
Good with.
I was, but I get.
He wanted a sandwich.
We may leave you some.